The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. That phrase is meant to illustrate how Satan has tricked mankind into believing sins are merely the result of human weakness instead of demonic influence. This has us lower our guard, allowing even more evil into our lives. Theology aside, this also suggests that subtle propaganda can be more effective than overt rhetoric. Nowhere is this sentiment more clearly illustrated than when it comes to the United States Civil War. Though the Confederacy surrendered, Southern sympathizers have never really stopped fighting, and much like the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, battlefields of opposing armies were replaced by arenas of propaganda and historical revisionism. It's easy to point to a Klan rally or cite the lies of people like David Duke and say the South is trying to rewrite history to make themselves look better. But in many ways, these are less insidious than other efforts, like naming elementary schools after slave owners and other Confederate heroes, because that targets the most impressionable and innocent among us: children. Which brings us to The Silent Witness, a true story of the Civil War, by Robin Friedman and illustrated by Claire A. Navola. The Silent Witness is set in the Civil War and tells the story of 4-year-old Lula McLean and her family, who owned a plantation in Manassas, Virginia. After 2 battles take place within cannon shot of the McLean residence, the family moves far away to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, only for the war to follow them there. Lula's favorite toy is a Ragdoll, made by her mother, which never leaves her side during the entire book until the very end, when it is abandoned by Lula in the parlor of the McLean home, right before the room is used by General Ulysses S. Grant of the Union Army to accept the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. To this historical event, Lula's doll becomes the Silent Witness.
He said it! He said it!
The book is marketed toward children between preschool and 3rd grade, with language and pictures deemed appropriate for that reading level. No one should expect The Silent Witness to feature Saving Private Ryan levels of battlefield gore, nor Gone with the Wind levels of battlefield aftermath. But considering this could be the first time a child is exposed to the concept of the Civil War, it's extremely important to get things right, and The Silent Witness fails spectacularly at historical accuracy, but likely succeeds in pro-Confederacy propaganda. Let's look at how the book begins. Little Lula enjoying a quiet moment with her doll on a hillside, overlooking the beauty of her family's holdings, a sprawling acreage neatly divided between crops of wheat, corn, and oats. If the reader squints, little brown dots can just be made out toiling in the fields of white, and what could be a man on a horse watching over them. An overseer, one might say. Slaves. They're slaves. Sweet little Lula McLean's family are slave owners on a southern plantation. The book is told almost exclusively from Lula McLean's perspective and doesn't even acknowledge the fact that not 100 feet away could be another 4-year-old girl living a life of bondage, in constant danger of being ripped from her mother's frantic arms and sold like cattle. Little Lula loved making candy and playing with her Ragdoll among the bountiful peach trees of her family's farm. Then, everything changed when the Union Army attacked. Actually, 4 months after the first 7 states seceded from the Union, it was the Confederate Army that fired the first shots in the Civil War, and while this fact is admitted by The Silent Witness, the accompanying illustration shows a vast line of Union troops in a warlike stance. But what happened that forced Virginia and the rest of the 13 southern states to secede? Wait. 13? What states made up the Confederacy? Let's see. First there was South Carolina, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed shortly afterward by Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. That's 11, not 13, Robin Friedman. Was this simply a stupid mistake, or a subtle fabrication trying to equate the Confederacy with the 13 colonial territories that founded the United States? I'm starting to question Robin Friedman's credentials as a historian. Anyway, what actually started the Civil War? According to the Silent Witness,
one of the main disagreements the Union and Confederacy had was over slavery. The North wanted to abolish it. The South wanted to preserve its way of life. When the South decided to leave the United States and form a new nation, war began. This is the kind of stuff I was talking about with subtle propaganda. The way Friedman describes it in her book, there could have been any number of reasons for the North and South to be divided, and slavery was just one of the bigger ones. Reputable historians, of course, lay the blame for the Civil War entirely on the South's determination to preserve slavery. All other secondary causes are directly attributable to the South's dependency on their peculiar institution. The war was fought over states' rights.
Yeah, primarily certain states' rights to own slaves. Meanwhile, the South objected to certain northern states exercising their states' rights to not be forced to help capture or return escaped slaves.
The war was fought over economic differences.
Yeah, primarily how the economy of certain states was almost entirely dependent on slave labor.
The war was fought over fundamental ideological differences.
Yeah, primarily how certain states thought it was morally justifiable to enslave an entire race of people. It's like how a death certificate states the cause of death, but will often include any other factors that immediately led up to it. Like how the little girl from Poltergeist died from a heart attack, but the reason she suffered one was because her body was in septic shock because she had a bowel obstruction. Bowel obstruction. Kind of like how Friedman and all Southern apologists are full of shit whenever they try to make the claim that slavery wasn't the primary cause of secession, especially when the declarations issued by the seceding states all mention the defense of slavery as a primary cause. But anyway, as the Silent Witness says, the North wanted to abolish slavery, and the South had no choice but to secede. What did Abraham Lincoln have to say about it?
I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races.
Huh. Well, Lincoln did sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the slaves, right? Let's look at the text. Wait a minute. This only applied to states that had already seceded, and it was signed after the war began, and it still kept slavery legal in the slave states that remained in the Union. That doesn't sound like the North was trying very hard to abolish slavery. Are you telling me that Lincoln was only concerned with preserving the Union and that abolishing slavery was really just a way to punish the southern states that he didn't have any control over at the time anyway, and that the North really wasn't trying to abolish slavery in the first place, but the South still started a war over it? I'm starting to question Robin Friedman's credentials as a historian. When Confederate forces arrived in Manassas, Lula's father agreed to help them by letting the troops use his house as headquarters. And later, by becoming a regular supplier for the Confederate Army, so by help, Friedman really meant be a war profiteer. After the Second Battle of Bull Run took place nearby, Lula's father started to get concerned for his family's safety. For some reason, most mentions of the battles of Bull Run are also referred to as the Battles of Manassas, because that's how they're referred to in the South. This always confuses me, because I thought victors wrote the history books, and hey, the good guys won the Civil War. Stop calling them the Battles of Manassas, please. That's like referring to the American Revolution as the War of the Ungrateful Colonial Scum. During the battles, a cannonball hit the McLean house, so Lula's father moved the family 143 miles away, which is an oddly specific measurement Friedman makes. Let's see what Google Maps has to say. So Friedman was less than a mile off for the distance the McLean family moved, but miscounted the number of states in the Confederacy? I'm starting to question Robin Freeman's credentials as a historian. Lula's new life in Appomattox Courthouse remained mostly the same, except she missed the pastures of her old home. And also the Union blockade was keeping medicine and other needed supplies from reaching their area. Then there was a huge battle fought in Gettysburg, and at the end a speech was given by what appears to be the colossal Titan. Later, wicked Union troops invaded the idyllic southern countryside and burned many farms and houses to the ground. Okay, that bit is kind of true. Southern families, meanwhile, buried their fortunes in an effort to hide them from the marauding Union troops, and most of these were undisturbed for 100 years until discovered by the Scooby Gang. Little Lula, meanwhile, decorated her house for Christmas, and oh my God, who is that? For the first and only time, the silent witness actually clearly shows one of the dozen or so slaves owned by Lula's family. Not that any of the children reading this book will fully realize the implications, but by holding that broom, this person is clearly in a subservient role. Is this yet more subtle propaganda, illustrating the Southern view of a black person's role in life? It's a pity buses didn't exist at the time this story is set. Perhaps a bunch of black people could have been kept in the back of one to further emphasize that point. With the war all but over and trapped near the McLean home, Robert E. Lee sent a contingent to find a suitable meeting place to surrender. His men met Lula's father and gained permission to use his home. What the silent witness doesn't mention is that McLean wasn't exactly eager to use his personal dwelling. It was only after the soldiers immediately rejected a nearby dilapidated house suggested by McLean did he reluctantly invite them to use his own place. On April 9, 1865, Grant and Lee met in McLean's parlor. Friedman took effort to describe Lee as tall, clean, and almost regal, with sash, sword, and shined boots. Grant, on the other hand, arrived late and dressed like a common soldier with muddy boots. According to the illustration, Grant and Lee appear to be reenacting the first meeting of Frodo and Gandalf. Who wouldn't think poorly of a slob like Grant? Especially since Lee towered over him at, per most sources, a whopping 5 foot 10 inches, with Grant, dwarf-like, at a mere 5 foot 8 inches. 2 inches separated the two men, but the silent witness has Grant at eye level to Lee's tits. I'm starting to question Robin Freeman's credentials as a historian. Lula fled the room when the military men entered, leaving her Ragdoll behind. The story ends with her beloved doll getting stolen by a Union soldier, and she never saw it again. The book, however, ends with an author's note providing more background information on the McLean family, as well as further examples of Union officers stealing more of the McLean possessions. Friedman also details that while the Civil War was the United States' most bloody conflict, it did usher in some milestones for the country, like the first Thanksgiving and military draft. She completely ignored how it effectively ended slavery, however, since that's apparently not that big of a milestone. The author's note also mentioned that Lula's Ragdoll is still on display at the Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. This is how the doll appears in The Silent Witness, and here is how it looks in real life. I'm starting to question Robin Freeman's credentials as a historian. One may question why I would devote so much time castigating a mere children's book for its historical inaccuracies, or how it focuses entirely on one character's single perspective without mentioning a greater evil going on around her. But it's precisely for those who would question the need to complain that I do so. Films like The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind went unchallenged for years as they painted a flattering view of the antebellum South and the efforts of the Confederate States to continue their lost cause. Southern people didn't need convincing that their views were correct, and some Northerners were swayed by the charisma of the actors involved. Both films were overt propaganda, and many people knew to be on their guard. Nowadays, it's unlikely teachers would screen either without first explaining to their classes about what the films were trying to accomplish, and afterward holding a discussion about just how badly the films represented the actual historical record. A book like The Silent Witness, however, flies under the radar. It was by mere fluke that I noticed it after my daughter brought a copy home from school. While the cover does have A True History of the Civil War in small print, its charming illustration of the little girl and her doll doesn't come close to depicting what's actually inside. Most parents would simply dismiss it as another boring children's book, and even if they read it, the subtle anti-union bias might slip past them. Or worse, if a parent is the kind to have Confederate flags scattered throughout their home, this is another tool they can use to help raise another generation to fight the lost cause. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Modern racists learned long ago the best way to propagate their hate isn't by appealing to those who already feel the same way. Despite the innate flaws in their personalities, many are articulate and attempt to reason with people in an effort to spread their bigotry. Unfortunately, they've had some small success with those whose minds were at least open to being swayed by this reprehensible ideology. Books like The Silent Witness may not plant the seeds of future intolerance, but at the very least, they furrow the soil a bit.